For 23 years, the Crankshaw family never missed their annual camping trip to Pine Ridge Valley. And for 23 years, someone always disappeared. What you're about to hear will make you question everything you thought you knew about family traditions. This is the story of America's most prolific family of serial killers, hiding in plain sight for over 2 decades. Let me paint you a picture of the Crankshaw family. Harold Crankshaw, 68 years old, spent 30 years as a respected bank manager in the small town of Cedar Falls, Ohio. After retirement, he dedicated his time to community service, organizing charity drives, volunteering at the local food bank, and serving on the town council. His wife Margaret, 65, taught elementary school for 3 decades. She played organ at their Methodist church every Sunday morning and never missed a PTA meeting when their children were young. Their 3 children, David, 42, Susan, 39, and Michael, 35, all grew up to be productive members of society. David worked as an accountant, Susan as a nurse, and Michael owned a small construction business. Between them, they had 12 grandchildren who adored their grandparents. The Crankshaws hosted neighborhood barbecues, attended high school football games, and were exactly the kind of family you'd want living next door. But here's where this story gets interesting. Every summer since 2001, the Crankshaw family would pack up their camping gear and head to Pine Ridge Valley, a remote area about 40 miles outside town. This wasn't your typical campground. There were no facilities, no other campers, no cell phone service. Just wilderness, accessible only by a narrow dirt road that most people didn't even know existed. Harold had inherited the land through an old mining lease from his father. The area was dotted with abandoned mine shafts from the 1940s, surrounded by steep cliffs and dense forest. A fast-moving river cut through the valley, and underground caves honeycombed the hillsides. It was isolated, beautiful, and completely private. The annual camping trip became sacred to the Crankshaws. 3 generations would gather for a long weekend of hiking, fishing, campfire stories, and what they called quality family time. Neighbors would comment on how wonderful it was to see a family so close-knit, so committed to maintaining their traditions. But here's what nobody knew. Every single year, without exception, someone would disappear during that camping trip, and the Crankshaws always had a perfectly reasonable explanation. It started in 2001 with Tommy Richardson. Tommy was 19 years old, a sophomore at Ohio State University, and David Crankshaw's roommate. He was studying engineering, came from a good family in Columbus, and had dreams of designing bridges. David invited Tommy to join the family camping trip that summer, describing it as a chance to disconnect from the world and enjoy nature. On the second night of the trip, Tommy decided to take an early morning hike to watch the sunrise from the ridge overlooking the valley. It was something he'd mentioned wanting to do since they arrived. Harold even helped him plan the route, marking the trail on an old topographical map. Tommy left the campsite at 4:30 a.m., carrying a flashlight and a thermos of coffee Margaret had prepared for him. He never came back. The family waited until noon before becoming concerned. They searched the area, calling his name, following the trail Harold had marked. When they couldn't find him, they hiked back to their trucks and drove to the nearest town to call the police. The search lasted 3 days. Rescue teams combed the valley, but the terrain was treacherous. The official conclusion was that Tommy had fallen into one of the deep ravines that cut through the area. His body was never recovered, which wasn't unusual given the geography. The case was closed as an accidental death. At Tommy's memorial service, the Crankshaw family was devastated. Harold spoke about the young man's enthusiasm for life, his kindness, his bright future cut short. Margaret played his favorite hymn on the organ, tears streaming down her face. David struggled to get through his eulogy, talking about his best friend and the adventures they'd shared. But here's what's chilling. As the family grieved publicly, they made a decision that would define the next 2 decades of their lives. They decided to continue the annual camping trips to Pine Ridge Valley, they said, to honor Tommy's memory. It became part of their family narrative. They were keeping his spirit alive by maintaining the tradition he'd been so excited to join. What nobody realized was that they weren't honoring Tommy at all. They were perfecting their method. The second victim came in 2003. Carol Brennan was Margaret's younger sister, a 52-year-old divorced mother of 2 who worked as a bank teller in Cleveland. She rarely saw her sister's family, so when Margaret invited her to join the camping trip, Carol jumped at the chance to reconnect. Carol was an excellent swimmer. She'd been on her high school swim team and still did laps at the local YMCA 3 times a week. So when she offered to swim across the river to retrieve a fishing rod that Michael had accidentally cast too far, nobody was surprised. Carol was confident in the water, even with the current, but she never made it to the other side. The family said they watched in horror as Carol was swept downstream by the unexpectedly strong current. Harold and David immediately jumped in to try to save her, but the water was too cold, too fast. They barely made it back to shore themselves. Carol's body was found 2 days later, caught in fallen logs about a mile downstream. The coroner ruled it an accidental drowning. Carol had suffered blunt force trauma to her head, but that was consistent with being swept into rocks by the current. The water in her lungs confirmed she drowned. There was no evidence of foul play. Once again, the Crankshaw family appeared to be tragic victims of circumstance. They had now lost 2 people they cared about in the same location. Many people suggested they should find somewhere else to camp, but Harold was adamant. "We can't let fear control our lives," he said. "This is our family tradition, and we won't let tragedy destroy it." Let me ask you something. What would you do if 2 people had died during your family camping trips? Would you keep going back to the same place? Most people would find somewhere else to camp, right? But not the Crankshaws. By 2008, the pattern was becoming clear, but nobody was connecting the dots. James Morrison was a 34-year-old drifter who'd been hitchhiking through Ohio when Harold picked him up on the way to Pine Ridge Valley. Harold was driving alone to set up camp before the rest of the family arrived, something he'd started doing after Carol's death, he said, to check for dangerous conditions. Harold told police that James had seemed like a nice young man down on his luck. He'd offered him a few days of work helping set up the campsite in exchange for meals and a place to sleep. James had no family, no permanent address, no one expecting him anywhere specific. He was, in other words, the perfect victim. According to Harold's statement, James had volunteered to gather firewood on the second evening. He'd taken a hatchet and headed into the forest around 6 p.m. When he didn't return by dark, the family organized a search. They found his hatchet near a steep embankment, blood on the blade and nearby rocks. The assumption was that he'd slipped, hit his head, and fallen into the ravine below. No body was ever recovered. The local sheriff's department handled the investigation. Since James was a transient with no family to pressure for answers, the case received minimal attention. It was filed as a probable accidental death and essentially forgotten. But here's what investigators didn't know. Harold's basement contained a detailed journal that Margaret had been keeping since 2001. In it, she recorded every aspect of their camping trips with the precision of a teacher's lesson plan. She noted the weather, the activities, the conversations, and most importantly, the deaths. Each entry was written in a code she developed, using the names of flowers and birds to represent different people and actions. The entry for James Morrison's death was particularly detailed. It described how they'd selected him specifically because he was isolated and vulnerable, how they'd lured him to the location, how they'd killed him, and how they'd disposed of his body in one of the old mine shafts. What makes the Crankshaw case so disturbing isn't just the number of victims, but the psychology behind it. This wasn't a single killer operating alone. This was an entire family, including the children, who participated in systematic murder for over 2 decades. The psychological profile that emerged during the investigation revealed a family structure built around Harold's control and a twisted interpretation of family loyalty. Harold's own father had used Pine Ridge Valley as a dumping ground for at least 3 victims in the 1960s and 70s. Harold had learned about this as a teenager, and instead of being horrified, had seen it as a family legacy to continue. When Harold married Margaret, he gradually introduced her to his family's dark secret. Margaret, who'd grown up in an abusive household and had learned to survive by pleasing authority figures, found herself drawn into Harold's world. The killing became a way for her to prove her loyalty and commitment to the family. The children were brought into the conspiracy gradually. David, the oldest, was the first to learn the truth when he turned 18. Susan and Michael followed when they reached adulthood. The family presented the killings not as murder, but as necessary actions to protect the family's reputation and freedom. Think about this for a moment. How do you convince three otherwise normal adults to participate in serial murder? The answer lies in the slow, methodical grooming that Harold had perfected. He'd start by involving them in small deceptions, helping to establish alibis, cleaning up evidence, keeping secrets. By the time they realized the full scope of what they were doing, they were already accomplices. The family developed specific roles for each member. Harold was the planner, choosing victims and locations. Margaret was the record keeper, documenting everything and developing cover stories. David handled the physical aspects of disposal, using his knowledge of the mine shafts and cave systems. Susan provided medical expertise, ensuring deaths appeared accidental. Michael, with his construction background, was responsible for any infrastructure needed: weighted bags for bodies, tools for disposal, modifications to the campsite. What's particularly chilling is how they justified their actions. In Margaret's journal, she wrote about the victims as threats to the family unity, or outsiders who didn't belong. They convinced themselves that they were protecting something sacred, their family bond, and that the lives they took were somehow less valuable than their own. Let me tell you about some of the other people who died during those camping trips, because each one had a story, a family, dreams that were cut short. In 2010, it was Kelly Morrison, Susan's best friend from nursing school. Kelly was going through a difficult divorce and had been struggling with depression. Susan invited her to the camping trip as a way to help her heal and reconnect with nature. Kelly's death was ruled a suicide. She'd apparently walked into the river in the middle of the night. Her body was found the next morning, and the family's grief seemed genuine. But Margaret's journal told a different story. Kelly had started asking questions about the previous deaths during the camping trips. She'd done some research and discovered that the Crankshaws had an unusual number of people die during their annual outings. She'd even mentioned contacting a journalist who investigated unsolved cases. The family couldn't risk exposure, so Kelly had to be eliminated. In 2015, it was Robert Chen, Michael's business partner. Robert had been pressuring Michael to pay back money he'd borrowed for his construction company. He threatened to involve lawyers, to put liens on Michael's property, to ruin his credit. Michael invited Robert to the camping trip as a gesture of good faith, claiming he wanted to discuss a payment plan away from the stress of their offices. Robert's death was attributed to a bear attack. His body was found mauled and partially eaten, about a mile from the campsite. The local wildlife officer confirmed that black bears were active in the area and that attacks, while rare, did happen. Robert's family was devastated but accepted the explanation. The truth, revealed in Margaret's journal, was far more brutal. Robert had been killed with a hatchet, then his body had been dragged to a location where bears were known to forage. The family had used animal bait to ensure scavengers would find and mutilate the corpse, obscuring the real cause of death. What strikes me most about these cases is how easily the explanations were accepted. The Crankshaws had built such a reputation as upstanding community members that the idea of them being involved in murder was literally unthinkable. They were the grieving family, the unlucky ones who kept experiencing tragedy. Nobody suspected they were the cause of it. How many people in your community do you trust completely? How many families seem so normal, so respectable, that you'd never question their version of events? That's exactly what the Crankshaws counted on, and it worked for 23 years. One of the most frustrating aspects of the Crankshaw case is how close investigators came to discovering the pattern, yet how systematically they were diverted from the truth. By 2018, Detective Maria Santos of the Ohio State Police had begun to notice connections between several missing persons cases. She'd been working cold cases and had identified a cluster of disappearances in the Pine Ridge Valley area dating back to 2001. What caught her attention wasn't just the location, but the timing. Most of the disappearances happened during the same weekend in August, year after year. Detective Santos requested files from 3 different counties and began building a timeline. She identified 7 victims who had disappeared in the Pine Ridge area between 2001 and 2018. All had been camping or hiking in the area. All had disappeared without a trace or been found dead under circumstances that suggested accidents. But here's where Harold's connections in the banking industry became crucial. Harold had spent 30 years building relationships with local business owners, including several who had ties to law enforcement. When Detective Santos began asking questions about the Pine Ridge disappearances, Harold learned about the investigation through his network. Harold didn't panic. Instead, he orchestrated a carefully planned response. He arranged for a prominent attorney to reach out to Detective Santos' superiors, expressing concern about the harassment of a respected family who had suffered multiple tragedies. He provided character references from city council members, church leaders, and business owners. He even arranged for a local newspaper to run a story about the family's commitment to their annual camping trips despite the tragedies they had experienced. The pressure worked. Detective Santos was reassigned to other cases, and the Pine Ridge investigation was quietly closed. The official reasoning was that the connections between the cases were circumstantial and that pursuing the investigation would be a waste of resources. Detective Santos later testified that she believed she could have solved the case in 2018 if she'd been allowed to continue her investigation. She'd already identified the pattern and was beginning to focus on the Crankshaw family. But the institutional pressure to protect a respectable family from unfounded suspicion prevented her from pursuing the truth. This is one of the most disturbing aspects of the case, how social status and community connections can shield people from scrutiny, even when evidence suggests they should be investigated. The Crankshaws weren't just killing people. They were using their reputation and influence to ensure they'd never be caught. While the Crankshaw family was busy maintaining their public image, they were also compulsively documenting their crimes. Harold was an obsessive photographer who documented every aspect of their camping trips. He had thousands of photos spanning 2 decades, carefully organized in albums and labeled with dates, locations, and participants. What Harold didn't realize was that his photography habit would eventually become evidence against him. The photos showed subtle changes in the campsite over the years, new areas that had been disturbed, equipment that appeared and disappeared, and most damning, the presence of victims shortly before they died. Margaret's journals were even more incriminating. She had recorded detailed accounts of every camping trip, including coded references to the murders. She developed an elaborate system using botanical and ornithological terms to describe their activities. A red cardinal meant a selected victim. Planting seeds referred to the act of murder. Pruning the garden meant disposing of evidence. The journals revealed the full scope of the family's activities. They hadn't just been reactive killers, eliminating people who posed threats. They'd also been proactive, selecting victims based on their vulnerability and the likelihood that their disappearances would go unnoticed. But perhaps most disturbing were the trophies. In a locked room in Harold's basement, investigators found items taken from each victim. Tommy Richardson's college ring, Carol Brennan's bracelet, James Morrison's wallet. Each item was carefully preserved and labeled with the victim's name and date of death. The trophy collection served multiple purposes. It allowed the family to relive their crimes, but it also served as a form of insurance. If any family member had tried to expose the others or leave the conspiracy, they would have been implicated by the evidence in the basement. The family had also kept detailed maps of the Pine Ridge Valley area, marking burial sites and disposal locations. These maps were cross-referenced with Margaret's journals and Harold's photographs, creating a comprehensive record of their activities. What's remarkable is how organized and methodical the Crankshaw family was. They weren't impulsive killers driven by rage or passion. They were systematic predators who treated murder like a business operation, complete with planning, documentation, and quality control. The Crankshaw family's reign of terror might have continued indefinitely if not for Sarah Chen, a 34-year-old documentary filmmaker from Los Angeles. Sarah had been researching local legends and folklore for a project about American mythology when she stumbled upon references to Pine Ridge Valley in old newspaper archives. What caught Sarah's attention wasn't the disappearances. Those had been reported in different newspapers in different counties and never connected. Instead, she was intrigued by stories about the old mining operations and reports of strange lights and sounds coming from the valley. She decided to investigate the area as a potential location for filming. Sarah arrived at Pine Ridge Valley on August 14, 2023, the same weekend the Crankshaw family was conducting their 23rd annual camping trip. She'd hiked in from the opposite direction, planning to spend a few days exploring the area and taking photographs for her documentary. What Sarah witnessed that weekend would expose the most prolific family of serial killers in American history. On her second night in the valley, Sarah was awakened by voices coming from the direction of the old mining area. She'd seen lights from the Crankshaw campsite during the day, but hadn't approached them, respecting their privacy. But the voices in the middle of the night seemed wrong, urgent, secretive. Sarah grabbed her camera and quietly made her way toward the sounds. What she saw through her telephoto lens was Michael Crankshaw dragging what appeared to be a human body toward one of the old mine shafts. She watched in shock as he dumped the body into the shaft, then began throwing rocks and debris on top of it. Sarah's first instinct was to run, but she forced herself to stay and document what she was seeing. She took dozens of photographs, recorded video, and made detailed notes about the location and timing. She also photographed the license plates of the vehicles at the Crankshaw campsite. When Michael finished his work and returned to the campsite, Sarah began her escape. She hiked through the night, navigating by moonlight and GPS, not stopping until she reached her car 12 miles away. By dawn, she was driving toward the nearest police station. The victim Sarah had witnessed being disposed of was Dr. Jennifer Walsh, a 41-year-old psychiatrist who had been treating Margaret Crankshaw for what she described as family stress. Dr. Walsh had begun to suspect that Margaret was involved in something criminal based on their therapy sessions. She'd started asking probing questions about the family's camping trips and the deaths that had occurred over the years. Margaret had invited Dr. Walsh to join them for a weekend camping trip, claiming it would help her understand the therapeutic value of family traditions. Dr. Walsh, who was dedicated to helping her patients, had agreed to the unusual arrangement. She never made it home. Sarah Chen's eyewitness testimony and photographic evidence gave investigators everything they needed to obtain search warrants for the Crankshaw property and Pine Ridge Valley. On August 20th, 2023, teams of forensic investigators descended on both locations. The search of Harold's basement revealed the trophy collection, Margaret's journals, and Harold's photographic documentation. The evidence was overwhelming, not just proof of murder, but detailed records of 23 years of systematic killing. The search of Pine Ridge Valley was even more revealing. Ground-penetrating radar identified disturbed soil in 15 different locations. Excavation revealed human remains, personal effects, and evidence of violent death. The old mine shafts contained additional bodies, some of which had been there for over a decade. The forensic evidence corroborated every detail in Margaret's journals. The victims had been killed in various ways, some beaten to death, others strangled, a few shot, but all had been disposed of in the same methodical manner, and all had been reported as accidental deaths or disappearances. As the evidence mounted, the family's carefully constructed facade began to crumble. Neighbors who had known them for decades were shocked to learn the truth. The elementary school where Margaret had taught for 30 years held counseling sessions for students and staff who couldn't process the revelation that their beloved teacher was a serial killer. The investigation also revealed the full extent of the family's influence operation. Harold had cultivated relationships with dozens of people in positions of authority: police officers, judges, reporters, business leaders. He'd used these relationships not just to deflect suspicion, but to actively suppress investigations. Phone records showed that Harold had been contacted whenever anyone began asking questions about the Pine Ridge disappearances. He'd received advance warning about Detective Santos's investigation in 2018 and had orchestrated the campaign to shut it down. The case became a textbook example of how serial killers can hide in plain sight when they have the right social connections and community standing. Under the weight of the evidence, the family's unity finally cracked. Margaret was the first to break, confessing to her role in the murders during a 14-hour interrogation session. She provided investigators with detailed accounts of each killing, explaining the family's methods and motivations. Margaret's confession revealed the psychological manipulation that had kept the family together for so long. She described how Harold had gradually drawn her into the conspiracy, starting with small lies and escalating to active participation in murder. She talked about the fear that had kept her compliant, fear of Harold's violence, fear of exposure, fear of losing her children and grandchildren. But Margaret also revealed something else: the intoxicating sense of power that came from taking lives and getting away with it. She described the thrill of manipulating investigators, of receiving sympathy from the community, of knowing that she and her family were responsible for unsolved mysteries that had haunted law enforcement for decades. David and Susan eventually provided their own confessions, describing their roles in the murders and the psychological toll of living with the secret. Both admitted that they'd wanted to stop multiple times, but felt trapped by their earlier participation. Michael, however, refused to cooperate with investigators. He maintained his innocence even when confronted with photographic evidence of him disposing of Dr. Walsh's body. His lawyer argued that the photographs were inconclusive and that Michael had been framed by other family members seeking to reduce their own sentences. Harold never confessed. Even when presented with overwhelming evidence, he maintained that his family was innocent and that they were being persecuted by law enforcement. He died of a heart attack in jail while awaiting trial, taking his secrets to the grave. One of the most important aspects of the investigation was identifying and honoring the victims. Many of the people killed by the Crankshaw family had been forgotten by the system. Transients, people with mental health issues, individuals who had been estranged from their families. The investigation team worked with victim identification specialists to determine the identities of the remains found at Pine Ridge Valley. DNA analysis, dental records, and personal effects were used to match bodies with missing persons reports. Tommy Richardson's remains were found in a cave about half a mile from the campsite. His college ring, which had been in Harold's trophy collection, was buried with him. His parents, who had spent 22 years wondering what happened to their son, finally had answers. Carol Brennan's death was re-examined based on Margaret's journal entries. The coroner's office amended her death certificate to reflect homicide rather than accidental drowning. Her children learned that their mother had been murdered by people she trusted. James Morrison's body was found in one of the deepest mine shafts, along with the remains of 3 other victims. Even though he'd been estranged from his family for years, his sister in Oregon had never stopped wondering what happened to him. The identification process revealed the full scope of the Crankshaw family's crimes. They had killed 23 people over 23 years, an average of 1 victim per year. The victims ranged in age from 19 to 67 and included both men and women from various backgrounds. What united the victims wasn't their demographics, but their vulnerability. They were people who could disappear without immediate investigation, individuals who were isolated, transient, or experiencing personal crises that made them easy targets. The trial of the surviving Crankshaw family members began in March 2024. The prosecution presented an overwhelming case based on physical evidence, confessions, and witness testimony. Sarah Chen's photographs and video footage were particularly powerful, showing the family's criminal activities in real time. The defense strategy focused on portraying the family members as victims of Harold's manipulation and abuse. They argued that Margaret, David, Susan, and Michael had been coerced into participating in the murders, and that they deserved lenient sentences based on their cooperation with investigators. The prosecution countered by presenting evidence of the family's active participation in planning and executing the murders. Margaret's detailed journals showed that she had been an enthusiastic participant, not a reluctant victim. The trophy collection demonstrated that the family had taken pleasure in their crimes, not simply endured them. The trial lasted 4 months and included testimony from dozens of witnesses. Victims' family members spoke about the decades of uncertainty they'd endured, not knowing what had happened to their loved ones. Community members testified about their shock at learning the truth about neighbors they trusted for years. In July 2024, the verdicts were announced. Margaret Crankshaw was convicted of 23 counts of first-degree murder and sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. David and Susan Crankshaw were convicted of multiple counts of murder and conspiracy, receiving sentences of life with the possibility of parole after 25 years. Michael Crankshaw, who continued to maintain his innocence despite the evidence, was convicted of 23 counts of first-degree murder and sentenced to death. The sentences reflected the court's assessment of each family member's role in the conspiracy and their level of cooperation with investigators. Margaret, as the record keeper and active participant, received the harshest sentence. David and Susan, who had provided detailed confessions and expressed remorse, received the possibility of parole. Michael, who refused to acknowledge his crimes, received the death penalty. The Crankshaw case sent shockwaves through law enforcement and the communities where the family had lived. It exposed serious flaws in how missing persons cases are investigated, particularly when they occur in different jurisdictions or involve transient individuals. As a result of the case, Ohio implemented new protocols for sharing information about missing persons across county lines. A centralized database was created to track disappearances and identify patterns that might indicate serial crimes. Training programs were developed to help investigators recognize signs of family-based criminal conspiracies. The case also highlighted the dangers of assuming that respectable community members are above suspicion. The Crankshaw family had used their social status and community connections as shields, deflecting scrutiny and suppressing investigations. Law enforcement agencies across the country began reviewing their procedures for investigating prominent families and community leaders. Pine Ridge Valley was designated as a crime scene and closed to public access. The old mining area was sealed to prevent further contamination of evidence and to serve as a memorial to the victims. Plans were announced for a formal memorial to be constructed at the site, honoring the 23 people who lost their lives there. The psychological impact of the case extended far beyond the immediate victims. The elementary school where Margaret had taught implemented counseling programs for students and staff who were struggling to process the revelation. The Methodist Church, where she had played organ for decades, held special services to help congregation members cope with their feelings of betrayal and confusion. The case became a subject of academic study, with criminologists and psychologists examining how an entire family could be drawn into systematic murder. The psychological profiles developed during the investigation provided new insights into family-based criminal conspiracies and the methods used to maintain secrecy over extended periods. Even with the convictions and sentences, important questions remain about the Crankshaw case. Investigators continue to examine cold cases from the 1960s and 70s, looking for evidence of crimes committed by Harold's father. The full extent of the family's criminal activities may never be known. There are also ongoing questions about the community's role in enabling the crimes. How many people suspected something but chose not to speak up? How many investigators were discouraged from pursuing leads because of the family's reputation? How many victims might have been saved if the pattern had been recognized earlier? The case has sparked debates about the balance between respecting privacy and investigating suspicious patterns. Some argue that the Crankshaw family's crimes could have been prevented if investigators had been more aggressive in pursuing connections between the disappearances. Others contend that the family's sophisticated deception and community connections made detection virtually impossible. What's your opinion on this? Do you think the warning signs were there all along, or were the Crankshaws just that good at hiding their crimes? How do we balance the need to investigate suspicious patterns with the rights of families to privacy and the presumption of innocence? These are questions that law enforcement agencies across the country are still grappling with as they work to prevent similar cases in the future. The Crankshaw family camping trips ended forever in 2023. But for the families of 23 victims, the questions and pain will continue for generations. This case reminds us that the most dangerous predators are often the ones who know exactly how to blend in, who understand how to manipulate our assumptions about respectability and community standing. Harold and Margaret Crankshaw, along with their children, spent 23 years perfecting the art of hiding in plain sight. They used family traditions, community connections, and social status as weapons, turning trust into a tool for murder. They showed us that evil doesn't always announce itself with obvious signs. Sometimes it wears the mask of the perfect neighbor, the dedicated teacher, the respected community leader. The victims of the Crankshaw family deserve to be remembered not just as statistics in a criminal case, but as individuals whose lives were cut short by people they trusted. Tommy Richardson, who dreamed of designing bridges. Carol Brennan, who was trying to reconnect with her sister. Dr. Jennifer Walsh, who died trying to help a patient. Each had hopes, dreams, and people who loved them. Their deaths were not accidents, coincidences, or natural tragedies. They were murders, carefully planned and executed by people who had learned to kill without conscience and lie without shame. The Crankshaw case is closed, but its lessons remain relevant. It reminds us to question our assumptions, to look beyond surface appearances, and to remember that monsters don't always look like monsters. Sometimes they look like the perfect American family, gathering around a campfire, sharing stories under the stars. But in the case of the Crankshaw family, those campfire stories were about the people they'd killed, and those stars were shining down on fresh graves. What do you think about this case? How do you balance trust in your community with awareness of potential danger? And how do we prevent future tragedies while still maintaining the social bonds that make communities strong? The story of the Crankshaw family is over, but the questions it raises about trust, community, and the nature of evil will continue to challenge us for years to come. Because the truth is, we never really know what's happening behind our neighbors' closed doors, or what secrets might be hidden in the places where families gather to make memories. Sometimes, those memories are built on the graves of the forgotten,